What's up, YouTube? This is 82 and 0. Welcome back. Today we're talking about Willis Reed, one of my favorite players of all time. He was born June 25th, 1942, and he was actually born in Louisiana. And now, when you think of centers in the 1960s and 70s, most frequently people obviously will mention Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell. But who comes to mind as the third best center of that era? Some people will say Nate Thurman. Some people will say Wes Unseld, whatever. But in my opinion, Willis Reed is right up there with them. Like I said, he grew up in Louisiana. He grew up on a farm in nearby Louisiana. His parents worked to ensure that Reed got an education. And he had a pretty good high school career. And he would attend Grambling University, which is an HBCU. And he played for the Grambling State Tigers men's basketball team. And Reed amassed over 2,280 points, averaging 26.6 points per game and 21.3 rebounds per game during his senior year. He led the Tigers to one NAIA title and 3 Southwestern Atlantic Conference championships. Reed also became a member of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. Now, as far back as the Knicks franchise goes, this might not shock a lot of people, but prior to Willis Reed, the Knicks didn't really have a lot of success. They were there right in the inaugural year, 46-47, the first year of the NBA. The Knicks were there. And through the 40s and into the early 50s, they had somewhat success, although they lost 3 finals in a row in 51, 52, 53. But by 57, they became a pretty bad team. And they missed the playoffs in 56, 57. They made the playoffs in 59, but then they would miss the playoffs again until the 65-66 season. So, in my opinion, it's not necessarily that these were just some blissful teams all per se, because they had some pretty good players. Richie Guerin, Willie Knowles, Johnny Green, but less teams back then. And when there's less teams, it means the saturation of players on good teams. They would have a lot more good players on a good team. So it's a lot harder to break through. And even the early Knicks, they had some pretty good players in the 40s and 50s. Like one player that in particular that comes to mind, and I'm sure a lot of people probably never heard of him, was Harry Gallatin. He's a Hall of Famer. Pretty good rebounder. But, they were always kind of known as this team that Wilt would beat up on. So, they draft Willis Reed, right? Now, Willis Reed, you'd think he would be a first-round draft pick. But he was actually drafted in the second round. Believe it or not. He was the second round first pick, 10th overall in 1964. And to me, that's a good what if, because he's better than the 10 players drafted before him, And this is what if I should do someday. The Los Angeles Lakers had the first pick that year. Or the 5th pick, I should say. And they selected Walt Hazzard. This means that the Lakers, who wanted a center for years in the 60s, could have drafted Willis Reed before they got Wilt. Just a fun fact to throw out there for everybody. It could have been Willis Reed, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor. But I'm getting off topic here. I'll get back on topic. So he goes to the Knicks for the 64-65 season. And he has a very good rookie campaign, putting up 19.5 points, 14.7 rebounds per game. And sadly, his Knicks don't do much. They were actually coached by Harry Gallatin, but they went 31-49. Now, the 65-66 season, they won 30 games. 66-67, they won 36 games. 67-68, this is when they started improving. They started getting a better young core. And they had some veterans on the team, like Walt Bellamy, who was a Hall of Fame center. So, let's talk about their young core. They had Walt Frazier now in 67-68. He was a rookie. Willis Reed was actually playing power forward because they were playing Walt Bellamy at center. And then they had guys like Cazzie Russell, Dick Barnett, Dick Van Arsdale, M. Bryant. It was not a bad team. They had a young Phil Jackson. But by 68-69, they had arrived. They were coached by Red Holzman, and they had the fourth best defensive rating in the league. But, in my opinion, and I could be wrong on this, I didn't grow up in this era. I'm kind of from the outside looking in. I think Willis Reed is the best defensive center after Bill Russell. What I mean by that is, once Bill Russell started declining, and after he retired, I think Willis Reed really took that mantle of being a great defensive center. But he did more on the defensive end. Like that 69 season, for example, he averaged 21-14. And they would lose in the Eastern Divisional Finals against the Boston Celtics in an upset. Now, 69-70, this team would come back with a vengeance. Russell is no longer in the league. They think, okay, this is our time. They go 60-22. They had the league's best defensive rating. And this is one of the greatest defensive teams of all time because you have, in his prime, Willis Reed guarding the post. Then you got Walt Frazier, who's probably the greatest defensive point guard of all time, him or Gary Payton. Then, like I said, they have Dick Barnett, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, Cazzie Russell. And I want to point out Dave DeBusschere was a really good defensive player himself. So you got 3 all-defense players. They defeat the Los Angeles Lakers in 7 games. And this is the famous Willis Reed game. And I'm sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. So Willis Reed had hurt himself, his knees, and he actually had a lot of knee injuries throughout his career. He was, for the most part, healthy early on in his career. But, he missed Game 6, right? Now, Game 7, the Lakers were thinking, we're going to be able to have this in the bag. Willis Reed's not playing. He's hurt, because all the speculation was Willis Reed's not going to be able to play. So the Lakers made the mistake they made the year prior in counting their chickens before they hatch. So what happened was Willis Reed, who was in excruciating pain with his knees, right? He took a shot of, I think it was cortisone. I'd have to rewatch the game. But anyways, he came out there limping, right? And the New York City, because they had home court advantage, the New York City crowd went ballistic when they saw Willis Reed come out. And you can kind of see the Lakers players like, oh shit. And although Willis Reed himself didn't have a good game. I mean, he was hurt. He played 27 minutes despite being in agonizing pain, and he only had 4 points. But here's the thing. Here's why it's called the Willis Reed game, because when he came out of that bubble, right, and he walked out onto the court, this erupted the Knicks, which in turn kind of put a fire inside the Knicks team. And Walt Frazier played the best game of his career. You know, it really inspired him. He had 36 points, 19 assists, 7 rebounds, and unofficially, because they didn't keep track of steals, he had 4 steals. Dick Barnett had 21 points. And Dave DeBusschere took down 17 rebounds, and they defeated the Los Angeles Lakers 113-99. Now, the following season, 70-71, the Knicks went 52-30. And Willis Reed, you know, he had a pretty healthy season. You know, he played 73 games, and they weren't able to repeat. They lost to the Baltimore Bullets in the second round, because by then, the NBA was 3 rounds. You know, they went to 3 rounds, I think, in 67. No, sorry, 66. So, Willis Reed and the Knicks lose in Game 7. Now, the following season, in 71-72, the Knicks would only win 48 games. And this is when Willis Reed only played 11 games because of knee injuries. But this, in my opinion, is when the team got a little deeper, because they acquired Jerry Lucas and Earl Monroe. And, you know, a lot of times people talk about super teams. I consider this a super team, because you had Walt Frazier, Jerry Lucas, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, Willis Reed, Dick Barnett, Earl Monroe, Phil Jackson. I know he's not like an all-star, but he was a good defensive player, a good rebounder. But, you know, they weren't able to repeat without Willis Reed. They made it to the finals in 72, and Willis Reed wasn't playing in that series. You know, the Knicks, this is a testament of how deep the Knicks were, because without Willis Reed, they still made the finals. And, yeah, they lost to the Lakers, but, you know, the team still had Walt Frazier and Jerry Lucas. Now, the following year, in 72-73, you know, the Knicks would go 57-25. And they'd return in a tough playoff run, defeating the Bullets and Celtics. And they actually upset the Celtics, who were 68-14, which is the all-time Celtics record for best record. They defeated them in 7 games. And in that 7th game, you know, it was just an outright upset. Nobody thought the Knicks were going to win that. And Willis Reed himself, you know, he didn't have the best game. He was struggling. You know, he was in a lot of pain, unfortunately, during this stage of his career. And they got a rematch against the Lakers. And they beat them in 5 games. Now, I do want to mention one thing. Like that game, like, a lot of these games that the Knicks were playing in 73, I'm not saying all of them, and you know, Basketball Reference, they don't always give stats that far back about who started, but I do know this from watching some games from that era. Willis Reed was coming off of the bench. He was playing 27 minutes per game, and he averaged 11 points and 8 rebounds. So he was kind of a shell of himself. And the reason they had him coming off the bench is his knees were hurting him so bad. And the lineup they would go with is they would have Jerry Lucas start at center. Or sometimes they would have this young kid named Luther Rackley start. Because there was one game I saw from that time period on YouTube where they had him start. But yeah, sometimes they'd have Jerry Lucas as the starting center, Dave DeBuscher at power forward, Bill Bradley at small forward, and then, Earl Monroe at shooting guard and Walt Frazier at point guard. They also had Henry Bibby, I want to point out. Just putting that out there. So, how good was Willis Reed? He missed the entirety of the following season in 70. They played in 74 he played in 74 the following season, but he'd only play 19 games. And he would miss the entirety of 74-75, which would be his final year. He'd retire because of knee pain. So he missed a lot of games at the end of his career. He was only 32 when he retired. So how good is Willis Reed? He's got career averages of 18.7 points per game, 12.9 rebounds per game. They didn't keep track of blocks until the 73-74 season, which was his final season that he played. And he averaged 1.1 blocks, which to me is impressive because it was only in 19 games that he played, and he was only playing 25 minutes. So, in his prime, he'd average 2 or 3 blocks per game. He's a 2-time champion, 7-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA, 1965 All-Rookie, 1965 Rookie of the Year. He's 1970 All-Defensive Team, 1970 All-Star Game MVP, 2-time Finals MVP, 1970 League MVP, and he's on the 75th anniversary team. In my opinion, like I said, he's right up there with the centers back then. Unfortunately, his career was just cut short due to injuries, but he was a great rebounder. He's a little undersized, he's 6'10", but he could bang down low with those 7-footers. And he had a great mid-range game for a center, especially back then. He had a lot of good post moves. This is why I don't like when he's compared to Dwight Howard, because yeah, I think maybe they're similar in their defense abilities, but Willis Reed had more offensive moves. And in my opinion, Willis Reed is the greatest Knick of all time. I'd put him above Patrick Ewing. And the reason I say that is Patrick Ewing didn't win an MVP. He didn't win championships. So it's hard for me to rank Patrick Ewing above Willis Reed. And I hate to say that because I really do like Patrick Ewing. I'm actually a pretty big Patrick Ewing fan. And these Knicks teams in the early 70s do not get talked about enough. How deep they were, how defensive-minded they were. And, they're a super team. How do I put it? They're like the Warriors of that time. Jerry Lucas and Earl the Pearl joining forces with the Knicks, Imagine, I've talked to a lot of fans from that day, and they talked about how it blew their minds when they joined the Knicks. So, what is your thoughts on Willis Reed? Where do you rank him all time? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching.